Back in the 1930s, the Soviet Union was going through a time of change, namely Stalin was gulagging or starving everyone he disagreed with, and then forcing everyone who remained to build enormous projects like this big dam in Ukraine. Stalin's 5-year plan, the Soviet Wonder Plan, was in full swing, and to power it, the Soviets needed to seriously upgrade their logistics networks to match because, well, the USSR, if you haven't noticed, was quite big. Logically, this meant more train tracks, more connections, and better planning. Right? No, this is the Soviet Union. The Soviet solution was to just make train bigger. At about this time in history, the cornerstone of all transportation in the USSR was done by steam trains. And yes, I can hear the excitement from the 5 of you that are train mad in the back. This one's all about steam trains. And to be honest, the mainstay of modern Russia and a lot of former Soviet countries' transportations and logistics these days are also trains. But they're all boring diesels and electrics, and steam trains are cooler, so let's talk about them instead. But what happens when you put the Stalinist Soviet Union in charge of building new, bigger trains, after you've already purged and gotten rid of all the smart people who've made trains before? Well, you get this. The AA20. Quite possibly the worst and stupidest train ever built. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union was pushing hard to industrialise. Rail freight was vital for moving raw materials, coals, ores, and really for general logistics. Heavy, powerful locomotives were in great demand. Meanwhile, globally, there was a trend to build even larger steam locomotives to haul heavier loads. This was particularly obvious in the US, where articulated designs or long non-articulated designs, where track length permitted them, were being pushed. The most famous of these mega trains was undoubtedly the Union Pacific's Big Boy. I love that name, Big Boy. A simple articulated train with a 4884 wheel arrangement. The Big Boy would make its debut in 1941 with 25 locomotives being built from 41 to 44, operating well into the 60s before being retired and replaced by modern locomotives. Today, 8 of these behemoths are still around and the Union Pacific still operates one, number 4014 in running order, as the largest and most powerful operational steam locomotive in the world. This mega train shows what can happen when thought and effort are put into building a locomotive, and above all, the benefits of keeping to a tried and true design, namely the 4884 wheel arrangement. Interestingly, the Yanks actually used a similar arrangement on the more numerous Challenger type of locomotives with a 4664 arrangement. But why am I talking about these two American trains? Well, it's to show you that to build a mega super large over-the-top steam train, you kinda want to get the basics right first, and then evolve the design into a bigger vehicle. Meanwhile, back in the USSR, engineers started to take notice of this success being experienced by the US large trains, taking particular notice of the Union Pacific's 9000 class. This train was a little different, having been built with a unique 412-2 wheel arrangement. But hang on, wheel arrangements, 4884s, 412-2s, what is all this? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I had no idea before I started to look in to make this video in myself, and I've been researching it for a while now to bring this to you. See, steam locomotive wheel arrangements describe the layout of leading, driving, and trailing wheels using the white notation. For example, 462, 4 leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels. This impacts the engine's stability, traction, and purpose. Different configurations like the Fast Pacific 462 or the Heavy Consolidation 280 were designed to suit specific roles such as passenger or freight service. The reason the Big Boy is a 4884 is that there are 4 wheels at the front, 4 wheels that lead and guide around the engine around corners, then 2 sets of 4 drive and power wheels, and then a set of 4 at the rear, which trail and offers support and stability for the firebox and driver's cabin. Well, it makes sense, right? Clear as mud? Yep, cool, we'll continue. The Soviet state rail company sent a group of 30 students, mind you, these are the ones that survived the purge, to the US to get some ideas on new trains. And it was during this trip that they began looking at the 9000 with its 412-2 configuration. The engineers excitedly took all of about 5 seconds and thought to themselves, well, why don't we just make bigger? Is this train big? Why don't we make bigger? Because we Soviet, we make bigger. And so the 414-4 configured AA20 was born. And oh good god above should it have been aborted at conception. Okay, so for this next bit, we're going to go through the stats of the train. This will be incredibly mind-numbing for those of you who aren't a train fan, and incredibly stimming for those of you who are, so feel free to skip ahead for a few seconds. I'll put the timestamp on screen to when we're done with the explanation, but here goes. The wheel configuration of the AA20 is a 4-14-4. That means there would be 4 leading wheels, 14 coupled driving wheels, 7 driving axles in rigid frame, and then 4 trailing wheels. They would connect in this unholy fashion that hurts my brain to look at, and well, if I have to stare at it, now you do too. Don't worry, I've employed the help of a train nerd to explain this in a little bit. The rail gauge would follow the stock standard Soviet broad gauge, which was 1.52 meters wide, and the length over couplings would be 33.7 meters, while the train itself would stand at over 5 meters tall and around 33 meters long. The train's driving wheel diameter was about 1.6 meters, yes, 1.6 meters, with the leading wheels being about 0.76 per meter and the trailing wheels being about a meter. Each axle would be expected to hold around 20 tons, with the train itself being over 200 tons. Now, this next bit about boilers, I'm just going to put this on screen because I'm going to be honest, I like trains, but I don't have this flavor of brain. Leave that there for a few seconds, feel free to pause. I'm sure that it means a lot more to a lot of you than it does to me, but I just know it's big. But these are all just facts and numbers. To actually explain how the train works, I went and spoke to a friend of mine who is quite possibly the biggest train dork on the planet Earth. He's not the Stick, but he is the Stick's train-obsessed cousin.
Hello there. This is going to get worse. Which I'm sure doesn't surprise any of you if you're long-time viewers of the channel, because it's Russia and it always gets worse. But you're about to learn just how bad the AA20 actually is. For context, the AA20 was built and designed in 1920s and 30s Soviet Russia, in the middle of the purges, with the brain drain, by an engineering team of university students or freshly graduated students with no previous building or design experience of steam engines, or in general. Kind of like a group project, and pun intended, it is a train wreck. To give you an idea of just how bad, the AA20 is using Russian coal, which gives no heat, and it has a too small smokebox. Not smokebox, firebox, apologies. A firebox, which you can see contains that area here. That's where the fire is, which isn't enough to properly steam the locomotive. The big boy makes 10 times as much boiler pressure, sitting at about 137 kilograms per square centimeter. I'm sorry if you use imperial, it doesn't make sense to me, we're using metric. 137. The A20 makes 10 times less. Big whoop. Not a surprise to anybody. So it can't go anywhere and it can't pull, which maybe because of Trans-Siberian Railroad quality is a godsend, but what limited power it can put down is still just as bad. The actual drive wheels, which you can see here, there's 7 of them per side, which makes 14, get them in such a unique way, I am not surprised it hasn't been recreated anywhere else. So, steam goes here, into cylinder. From cylinder, it goes to the connecting rods, to the main drive bar, here. You can see that massive bar over there. For better clearance sake, it's just above the blue line. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4 wheels deep is where all the power gets transmitted here. That is the first energy transfer. From there, we have 2 secondary power transfers. That 4th wheel is connected to the first 3 and the 5th, which on a normal steam locomotive, that is it. There is no other power transfers, all the wheels get even power. Not for the AA20, because from there you might be wondering, well, how do the last 2 wheels get their power? They have a separate coupling from the 4th to the 5th, and the 5th then goes to the 6th and 7th. Okay, I guess, you know, because it's Russia, why not? And it might seem like a good idea at the time, but it is, again, someone explained to me the sense behind this, I don't know. If you're wondering what all doohickeys and metal bits above those connecting rods do, they don't transmit power, it is purely there as a timer. Think of it as like the valves in your car, the camshaft and the cam rods. It's timing for the steam, it doesn't do anything for the power. Not directly anyway. You might be wondering, okay, so it has a complicated way of putting down the power, so do most German tanks. What makes this particularly bad? The AA20, as has been mentioned, has such poor maneuverability. Even the Soviet design team knew this. So what did they do? Now, they made the third, fourth and fifth wheels here, the main drive wheels, keep that in your head, flangeless. Now, for those railway nerds in the back that already know what that means, calm down, we'll bring the others up to speed. What a flange is, and I'll do a very rough diagram here, is a wheel, like so, with a sticky out bit there. Because when you have a metal track, as I'm crudely drawing here, metal on metal isn't that grippy. It's actually got really low friction. So the flange is there to make sure that the wheel doesn't fall off sideways. And yes, the rail is angled and the wheel is angled at certain measurements, so please don't take this literally, I'm giving you the context. And so what a flangeless wheel is a wheel with no sticky outer bit that can slide about. And again, this is on the main drive wheels. Can you now see how that just doesn't work? And yes, that also means there's a non-zero chance that as the train is going around the corner, the wheels either aren't touching the track, are just spinning, or doing nothing. Yay, I guess. Another really just bizarre thing is I mentioned before just how the power is transmitted to the drive wheels. A steam engine is not balanced. The connecting rods go up and down, and they're also not in sync. They actually go left and right at different rotations. So the whole engine is bouncing and shuffling along the track. So on top of the wheels not having flanges and staying on the track, the engine itself is trying to force itself off. Yeah, it's no wonder this thing was derailing so often. And on top of that, the trailing wheels here and the leading wheels here have a unique suspension system. They were allowed to deviate, not pivot. Pivoting left and right, you know, as a car would turn its wheels, was not how the AA20 cornered. What would happen is that it was allowed to horizontally move off-center, as in if this is 0 and the front of the AA20, the front leading wheels could move up to 14.5 centimeters left and right from that dead center, with the rear wheels moving up to 28 centimeters off center. I want you to think of a ruler, your average ruler that you've used in school. Get that distance, in front of you or imagined. That is how far away the wheels could move away from the locomotive at speed, while the whole thing is jumping off and down off the tracks with no grip on the main power wheels. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me either.
Okay, now that you're all asleep or absolutely stimming from his little show and tell, and from the steam trade, really depends on the person, let's get back to the narrative. Soviet government officials, likely blowing a hole in their pants from excitement at the prospect of the gigantic train, approved the design and work began in 1934. The project was so big though that the USSR needed help from abroad, so it involved cooperation with the parts and initial work being undertaken by Krupp in Essen, at the time in Pinwheel Cartoonville in Germany. These parts were then upon completion shipped over to the Voloshilov locomotive factory in what is now modern-day Luhansk in Ukraine. Some further design features and special modifications were incorporated in attempts to mitigate the difficulties of such a large rigid wheelbase, these including addressing the fixed driving axle configuration, which caused significant issues negotiating curves. To help, the middle 3 driving axles were made flangeless, so that those wheels wouldn't bind or cause too much lateral force on the curves, Remember when my train nerd friend described the wheels that actually have power to them? Yeah, they're the wheels that have power to them. They took their ability to actually stay on the track off. Go Soviet Union. The front and rear driving axles were provided with lateral motion devices to improve curving ability, but like he said in the video, didn't do much. The leading bogie pilot and trailing arrangement were also designed to help with stability. Didn't do much. Once it was finished, the train rolled out onto the tracks, and you're about to see why this was only undertaken once and why one unit was only ever completed. A second was planned but never finished, and we're about to find out exactly why. The AA20 was sometimes given the name AA Andreev in honor of Andrei Andreev, a hardline Stalinist, and so eloquently put by Simon Montefiore when the purchase came around. This Andreev became the unchallengeable master of these murderous sideshows. Some highlights include this absolute creature of a human being, because remember, he is human even though he's barely able to get that title, would randomly travel around the Soviet Union, find a local party leader, accuse them of being a traitor, or he'd rock up into a town, say that they'd arrested the wrong people, and then order everyone to arrest other random people. And he would then himself organise mass executions. Seriously, look this guy up, he's just the worst. Fitting that this absolute hunk of crap was named after him. Kind of suits the personality. Now, it must be said, on paper, this train looked amazing, and in person its sheer size must have been awe-inspiring. It was thought that the huge boiler with a massive firebox would be needed because the coal quality was so low. Yes, the Soviets were planning for their coal to be crap. And the logic was that this train would then need to burn more coal than its contemporaries in order to power it along, dragging behind it the wealth of the USSR. But in reality, it had serious flaws in practice, and I mean serious flaws, as a number of trials carried out would prove. Let's go through some of the issues. Starting with curves, track, and wheelbase. The rigid frame with 7 coupled axles resulted in a very long fixed wheelbase. Even with flangeless middle axes and lateral motions in the outer driving axles, the AA20 was often unable to stay properly on tracks in curves. It frequently derailed in extremely stupid ways by just popping off the tracks or falling through them because it was so heavy, and this was especially common at switches where the track would bend or just be completely squished by the locomotive. That brings us to point number 2. The train itself was so heavy and so long that besides its constant derailing problems, it put excessive lateral push forces on the rails, especially when it came to curves. This weight and torque physically pushed the tracks apart, performing that, plopping in the middle of the tracks issue I just mentioned. It would permanently damage the tracks, the rails themselves, the sleepers, and components of the track infrastructure like points. The high forces in curves made track maintenance basically impossible, and if the AA20 ran on a track, any following train would be told basically, lol, good luck. Remember how I said at the start the solution to the Soviet freight problem was more tracks and infrastructure? Well, this is where Yuri's idea of building a bigger train was extremely flawed. The AA20 was too large for many of the existing facilities, turntables, engine sheds, and any other service structures that were often too small to accommodate its length, limiting where it could go and who could maintain it, and, defeating its purpose in the first place. Oh, you thought we were done? Oh no, we're not close yet. While its tractive effort was high for Soviet trains, this also put strain on couplers. The couplings used on rolling stock sometimes were not strong enough to cope with the forces the AA20 could exert, and carriages would just pop off. The design required high steam generation, but like we've been saying, the coal quality and water quality and feeding capacity limited the ability to sustain maximum power. The locomotive reportedly had poor steaming. In some trials with the rate of steam generation, superheated performance, and other boiler dynamics barely able to keep up with demands, meaning that this giant would lumber along slowly, inhaling insane amounts of coal for little reward. Think about driving your car in second gear with the limiter screaming at you the entire time, or trying to get an asthmatic to run a marathon by pulling a go-kart with no food for 3 days. By comparison, the big boy had 10 times the boiler pressure, double the pulling power at double the speed, compared to the coal it ran on oil and had an automatic mechanized stoker. Yeah, the big boy was just better in every way. And that brings us to the rub. With all these limitations, it could never enter regular service. So despite its enormous size and its engineering efforts to adapt, the AA20 was essentially practical for regular use. The train was very much like the latest Soviet Konkordsky, It looked really impressive, but in reality, it was a gigantic white elephant. But that raises the question, what could the Soviets do with it after trials? Oh come on, I don't need to ask this question. The answer is propaganda, of course. Now, normally this would be where we end the video laughing, but let's stop and ask ourselves why this mega train failed, because it is interesting. The AA20 is on paper not the worst idea, bigger train to pull bigger freight in what would be a bigger economy, and most countries did make bigger trains for bigger loads, like the Big Boy in the US or the Garrett in the Commonwealth. But the Soviets just really weren't thinking here, and they couldn't get past the propaganda value of having the world's biggest train. One of the biggest failures of the AA20 was its framing, which brings us to the rigid frame and lack of flexibility, literally. Non-articulated frames are simpler in many respects, but when you scale up the number of coupling axles, your fixed wheelbase becomes huge. Curves and switches demand some flexibility through lateral motion and cornering ability. The AA20 tried to mitigate this with those improvements, I'm using improvements in air quotes here in Luhansk that I mentioned before, but they weren't enough to overcome the effects of a very long rigid driver set, or weren't very well thought out, if at all. Similarly, the design of a really big boiler in theory can deliver a lot of steam and power, but in practice fuel quality, water quality and steaming rate and daily operating demands make a huge difference. If coal is less than ideal or feed water is inadequate, you'll get poorer performance and need more maintenance. These kind of supporting systems are often the unseen limit when it comes to these megatrains, and unlike in the US, there were significant track infrastructure constraints for trains of this size. The existing Soviet track in many places was simply not engineered for large locomotives. The curves were too tight, switches were not designed for the force, turntables too small, rails and sleepers not strong enough for the stresses, etc. To deploy a locomotive like the AA20, it would require upgrading the track, loading gauges, turntables, which defeats the point of making it in the first place to avoid having to invest in massive track upgrades. Up until 1939, the Trans-Siberian Railway, for example, was only a single track. It's part of the reason why you have so many instances during the Soviet-Russian Civil War where you've got trains full of Czechs coming into stations with prisoners of war full of Hungarians, and they proceed to start having brawls with each other because they're stuck together and they've been enemies for years, forced to live together. It just doesn't end well. So that leaves you with the only other choice, which is more modifications on the train. More moving parts means larger structures, heavier components means more wear, more maintenance, more opportunity for failure. In some parts, like couplers, track joints and switches, are being stressed beyond typical design usage, their failure rates rise. The AA20's frequent track damage and derailing would only increase the maintenance demands, rather than help fix the problem. Even if the locomotive in principle could haul larger loads or reduce the number of engines needed, the cost of upgrading the infrastructure and higher maintenance, lower availability and frequent failures would make the train simply not worth it. Which begs the question, how in the hell did the Soviets manage to produce both arguably the worst ever train on the planet, but also one of the best steam engines ever made? Well, two of the best steam engines ever made, come to think of it, at the exact same time. The Soviet FD, Felix that, and IS, Joseph Stalin series steam locomotives, in stark contrast to the monster that was the AA20, represent two of the most successful and iconic examples of heavy steam power in the USSR's rail history. They also produce what is, in my opinion, one of the coolest looking trains ever made. Yes, I know the Mallard is very cool and the Flying Scotsman, they take the cake, but look at this, it's so nice! The FD series first was introduced in the early 1930s, and it was a 210-2 heavy freight locomotive designed to haul long and heavy freight trains across the vast expanses of the USSR. This train really became a workhorse for the USSR, and over 3,000 of them were built. A little later, in the mid-1930s, the IS series entered the picture as a 284 passenger locomotive, intended for long-distance passenger services. Both of these locomotives marked a major leap forward in Soviet train technology and manufacturing capability. The FD in particular became the backbone of the Soviet freight operations for decades. It's also the backbone of the Soviet zombie post-apocalyptic train network, which is a whole thing that I could make a video about in itself. The FD design was rugged, reliable, and relatively easy to maintain. It couldn't pull the biggest loads, sure, but for the state of the Soviet rail network, it was the perfect compromise between freight load sizes and speed, meaning that this train excelled in Soviet conditions. This rings especially true given the often undeveloped and widely spaced infrastructure of the USSR at the time and into the following years. The IS, or Joseph Stalin series, meanwhile, while built in smaller numbers at around 700 units, was a complete prestige project, and it became the flagship of Soviet express trains before and after World War II. These locomotives were faster than the FD, and were praised for their smooth running and superior speed capabilities, reaching speeds of up to 120 km an hour. Their design also included more advanced features like roller bearings and better streamlining, making them suitable for the prestigious services like the Red Arrow Express between Moscow and Leningrad. They're also my second favourite train of all time, if you can't tell. I really like the IS series of trains. In comparison, the horror show that was the AA20 was nothing more than a monstrous attempt at leapfrogging and running before they could walk. Designed in '34 at the same time as these two amazing trains were entering service, the AA20 represents the very worst parts of the Soviet Union, the things that destroyed its navy and turned it into a punchline of so many of my jokes. From an engineering perspective, the FD and the ISs were conservative yet effective. They were scaled-up versions of proven American and European locomotive designs adapted for Soviet conditions. Yeah, that's the craziest part. Remember those scientists and train engineers that the USSR sent to the US that designed the psychotic AA20? They built the FD and IS too. Well, not the IS2, that's different. The IS as well. Yeah, we'll go with that. The FD's 210-2 configuration was modelled partly after the American Santa Fe type locomotive, and it was chosen for its excellent balance of tractive effort and weight distribution. Its ability to negotiate curves better than the AA20, combined with its better manoeuvrability, made it a far more practical solution to the USSR's freight hauling needs. Similarly, the IS Series 284 wheel arrangement offered high speed and stability, ideal for fast passenger runs. Both designs reflected a practical philosophy: build fewer types of locomotives in large numbers, focus on ruggedness over innovation. In contrast, the AA20 represented a more experimental and almost ideological engineering approach, the one that attempted to showcase Soviet technological superiority through sheer scale rather than operational success, aka the AA20 is Wunderwaffe, the IS and the FD are actually good. In terms of historical significance, the FD and the IS classes were instrumental in both the economic and military logistics of the USSR during the Second World War and the post-war Reconstruction period. The FD particularly hauled countless tons of military supplies, troops, and industrial equipment across thousands of kilometres under extreme conditions. The IS series, while less numerous, symbolised the prestige and modernisation of the Soviet rail system and remained in use well into the 50s and 60s, even as diesel and electric traction began to take over. The AA20, by contrast, has become a complete meme, and it died in obscurity. For those wondering, there are plenty of FD series in storage across the Soviet Union, partially as doomsday trains, which again I can get into in another video if the topic is interesting to people, but also in museums all across former Soviet states. There is sadly just one IS train left in existence, and it's on a plinth in Kyiv. I do wish there was more, particularly in the colour blue, because as you can see here in Workers and Resources Soviet Republic, the blue IS is absolutely stunning. The biggest reason above all why the AA20 failed and the Union Pacific 9000 didn't really just came down to the constraints of other countries that they were built in. The UP 9000s were built within the constraints of the American infrastructure system, a country with wider curves on some lines, heavier rails as well. They also benefited immensely from maintenance and repair facilities which were less sparsely spread out than they were in the USSR. It's the same reason that the FD became one of the workhorse heavy freight locomotives classes in the USSR, because it was more successful and more practical than the AA20 and it fit the Soviet network. The existence of the FD class and its improving subsequent classes meant that once those proved viable, the need for something as radical as the AA20 was less pressing. Articulated locomotives elsewhere, many railways opted for articulated designs, for example the Mallet and the Garrett, allow large boilers and driving wheels, but with the ability to handle curves more flexibly. The AA20's rigid frame was always going to struggle more than these other trains. After its trials in the mid-1930s, the only AA20 to ever exist was never adopted into regular service. It sat idle or was held in storage at Shipping Test Facility for many years, where it remained essentially an oddity, sitting, rusting away before it was scrapped in 1960. Some say that it was used for test in the 30s and the early 40s, but for all intents and purposes, I couldn't find any proof that could actually back those claims up. So for all we know, it just sat there and rusted for years and years and years. But that's it. That's the story of the AA20 Super Mega Awesome's Uber train from the USSR. The train that was so big that it broke the tracks it ran on. This one particularly interests me because on the surface, the train suffers the same problems as the Navy. But unlike the Navy, this train would be developed aside two incredibly successful designs, the FD and the IS, by the exact same people, proving that maybe, just maybe, common sense is the better option when it comes to infrastructure, and that politicians should bugger off when it comes to designing things. If you'd like to support the channel, please see the link to Patreon in the description below, like, comment, subscribe, and before I catch you all next time, I want to point out that I have recently started a new channel with Rex's Hangar called The Lesser of Two Weevils, where we will go through and we will discuss nautical history. That includes nautical history about the Russian Empire in the Age of Sail. Yes, that's right, this channel is just Age of Sail. We're not going to be looking at engines, we're not going to be looking at steam, we're not going to be looking at anything new and modern and fandangled. We're going to be focusing on the glorious Age of Sail, its romanticism, the truth behind it, exploration, tragedy, and all sorts of things about it. Rex has already put out a video on William Dampier, and I've just finished my series on the tragedy that was the sinking of the clipper ship Dunbar. So, if you want to see some more nautical history, and you want to see it from the two of us, who we do have quite a big lap over of fan bases, check it out, link in the pinned comment, and I will catch you all next time. Thank you for the help to my colleague, who is the megaest train nerd on the planet, and like I said, he's not the Stig, but he is the Stig's train-obsessed cousin.